The evening began like any other at the Grand Hotel. The chandeliers glowed softly above the crowd, their golden light bouncing off the marble floor. Expensive perfume filled the air, and laughter echoed through the hall. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved quietly between tables carrying trays of sparkling glasses. Everyone was dressed in their best, the men in sharp suits, the women in shimmering gowns. It was one of those nights where everything looked perfect from the outside. Among the guests was a man named Edward Langston, a well-known millionaire who enjoyed being the center of attention. He owned several businesses and loved to talk about his success. Whenever he entered a room, people noticed. He had that confident walk, that kind of smile that told everyone he knew how important he was. For Edward, these charity events were less about giving and more about being seen. He liked the praise, the photos, and the whispers that followed his name. Working quietly in the background that night was a young waitress named Clara Evans. She wore a simple black uniform and kept her hair neatly tied back. Her job was to make sure the guests had everything they needed, refill their drinks, bring food, clear plates, and smile no matter how tired she was. She moved carefully, always polite, never drawing attention to herself. But behind that calm expression, Clara's mind was elsewhere. Every time she passed the corner of the room, her eyes drifted toward the grand piano sitting near the stage. The piano was stunning, polished white with gold edges. Its lid opened just slightly so the light caught the strings inside. Clara couldn't help staring at it. That instrument wasn't just a decoration to her. It was a reminder of a life she had once dreamed of. Before she was a waitress, before everything had changed, the piano had been her world. A few years earlier, Clara had studied music at a small conservatory. She was one of those rare students who didn't just play notes. She made the piano speak. Her teachers saw something special in her, a spark that couldn't be taught. They believed she could go far. But then life took a hard turn. Her mother fell seriously ill and medical bills began to pile up. With no father in the picture and no family to help, Clara had no choice but to leave school and find work. Now, instead of performing on stage, she served food to people who didn't even notice her. Still, every time she saw a piano, her fingers twitched slightly, as if they remembered what it felt like to play. That night, she was serving drinks to a group of wealthy guests gathered around Edward. He was in one of his moods, loud, joking, telling stories that made everyone laugh. He bragged about his new house, his car, and even his rare collection of wines. People laughed at everything he said, even when it wasn't funny. It was that kind of crowd, where everyone wanted to stay on the good side of money. At one point, Edward's attention shifted toward the piano. "They brought that thing just for decoration," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Probably cost a fortune and no one here knows how to play it." The guests chuckled. Clara, passing nearby, glanced at the instrument again. She didn't mean to, but her gaze lingered. Edward caught her looking. "Oh?" he said with a grin. "Our waitress seems interested." "Maybe she's a hidden pianist, huh?" The table laughed. Clara froze for a moment, unsure what to say. She gave a small, polite smile and continued pouring water, trying to ignore the teasing. But Edward wasn't done. "Come on," he said, waving his hand. "Don't be shy. Let's see what you've got." The laughter around the table grew louder. Some guests clapped lightly, encouraging the joke. Clara felt her cheeks burn. It wasn't anger, not yet, but that mix of embarrassment and sadness that comes when people think they're above you. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the background like she usually did. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I'm working right now," Edward smirked. "Oh, of course. Don't worry, I'm only joking. Wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself." He turned back to his guests, laughing at his own comment. Clara forced a smile and walked away, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her tray. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the rush of emotions inside. She had dealt with people like Edward before, people who thought a uniform meant you were less than them. Normally, she let it slide. But something about the way he laughed, the way everyone joined in, stayed with her. The night went on. Music played softly from the speakers and the guests enjoyed their dinner. But Clara couldn't stop thinking about that piano. Between serving tables, she glanced at it again and again. In her mind, she could hear melodies she used to play, songs that once brought her peace. Her fingers ached to touch the keys, to feel that familiar connection again. Later, as the evening began to wind down, the event host announced a short break before the next speech. The room buzzed with chatter as people got up to stretch or grab another drink. Edward, still surrounded by his admirers, leaned back in his chair, laughing about something that had happened on one of his yacht trips, and then, almost without thinking, Clara found herself walking toward the piano. Her steps were slow at first, hesitant, but her heart was racing. She wasn't sure what she was doing, only that she couldn't resist anymore. The piano seemed to pull her in, like it had been waiting for her all night. A few of the guests noticed her. They whispered to each other and smiled, thinking it was part of some joke. "Look," one of them said, "the waitress is actually going for it." Laughter rippled through the crowd again. Edward turned in his chair, amused. Well, he said loudly. "Looks like we're about to get a free show." Clara stood there for a moment, staring at the keys. Her hands hovered just above them. The room wasn't completely quiet. People were still chuckling, but she tuned it all out. For her, there was only the piano and the sound of her own heartbeat. She thought of her mother, the hospital bills, the long nights she had spent working to keep things together. She thought of the life she had put on hold, the one she still dreamed of even when it felt impossible. A soft breath escaped her lips and she closed her eyes for just a second. Then slowly she pressed the first key. The note was soft, almost hesitant. A few people stopped talking. Then came another note and another, gentle, uncertain, but beautiful. The laughter faded into silence as the melody began to take shape. Edward's smile froze. He didn't know it yet, but what was about to happen would change the mood of the entire evening, and it would be something no one in that room would ever forget. For a moment, no one knew what to say. The soft melody coming from the piano filled the hall like a gentle whisper. It wasn't loud or showy, but there was something in it that made people pause. Clara's fingers moved slowly, carefully at first, as if she was trying to remember a language she hadn't spoken in years. Each note seemed to come from deep inside her, full of quiet emotion that words couldn't express. Some guests exchanged puzzled glances. They didn't expect her to actually play. A few tried to laugh again, but the sound quickly died in their throats as the music continued. The melody grew richer, more confident. Her hands moved gracefully across the keys, and the tune began to bloom into something hauntingly beautiful. Edward sat back in his chair, still smirking, but his expression had started to change. He wasn't laughing now, though he wanted to. There was something in her playing that felt different, something that made even him listen. He didn't understand the piece, but he could feel the emotion behind it. Clara wasn't aware of the crowd anymore. In her mind, she wasn't a waitress standing in front of a group of wealthy strangers. She was back in the small practice room at her old music school, surrounded by sheet music and the faint smell of old wood and varnish. She remembered her teacher's voice telling her, "Don't just play the notes and tell your story." That was what she was doing now. Without meaning to, she was pouring her story into the keys. Her memories came rushing back. The excitement of her first recital, the long hours she'd spent practicing until her fingers hurt, the moment she had to walk away from it all when her mother fell sick. Every joy, every heartbreak, every piece of herself she thought she had lost was suddenly alive again in her music. The people around her were silent now. The laughter was gone. Some were leaning forward, drawn in by the emotion they could feel but couldn't explain. The sound of the piano echoed through the grand hall, bouncing softly off the marble walls. For that short moment, everyone was connected by something invisible, something real. When the last note finally faded, the silence that followed felt heavy. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she lifted them from the keys. She blinked, realizing what she had done. The world around her slowly came back into focus. The expensive clothes, the crystal glasses, the faces staring at her. And then suddenly, the spell broke. A few people began to clap awkwardly at first. One or two guests stood up, smiling in surprise. But just as the applause began to grow, Edward stood and forced a loud laugh. "Well," he said, clapping slowly, "that was unexpected." His tone was sharp, with a hint of mockery. The laughter he had killed earlier began to return as his friends followed his lead. "Not bad," another guest said, smirking. "Didn't think a waitress could actually play." Clara felt her heart sink. The applause she had heard a moment ago faded into uncomfortable murmurs. She forced a smile, trying not to let it show that their words hurt. Edward walked closer, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble. "Where did you learn that?" he asked in a tone that didn't sound like genuine curiosity. "You play well for someone who's..." Serving drinks, Clara swallowed hard. I studied music once, she said softly, before I had to stop. Edward nodded slowly, pretending to be impressed. Ah, of course. One of those stories. Life got in the way, huh? Still, you've got some talent. Maybe you can play in restaurants one day. A few people laughed again. Clara looked down at her hands. She wanted to say something, to tell him that music wasn't just a hobby for her, that it had once been her life. But she didn't. Instead, she quietly stepped away from the piano and went back to her work, her heart aching. The rest of the evening continued, but something felt different now. The guests kept talking, eating, and drinking, yet many of them kept glancing at the piano as if it still held a piece of that melody. Some of them even whispered to each other about the waitress who played better than most musicians they'd seen, but no one said it out loud. It wasn't the kind of place where people liked to admit they were wrong. Clara tried to focus on her job, but her mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment she played. She could still feel the warmth of the keys beneath her fingertips. Part of her felt embarrassed, but another part, a small, quiet part, felt alive again. It had been years since she had touched a piano, and for a few minutes, she had remembered who she really was. When she went to collect the empty glasses from Edward's table later that night, he looked up at her with a smirk. You know, he said, you've got guts. Most people would have been too scared to play in front of this crowd. I'll give you that, Clara nodded politely. Thank you, sir. But next time, he added with a laugh, try something more upbeat. That piece was so sad I almost lost my appetite. His friends laughed again, and Clara just smiled, pretending she didn't care. Inside, she did care. Not about his approval, but about the way people like him always turned beauty into a joke. She wondered how someone could be surrounded by so much luxury and still miss what really mattered. After the event ended, the hall slowly emptied. The music stopped and the chatter faded into silence. Clara helped her co-workers clean up, folding napkins, stacking chairs, collecting dishes. Her feet hurt, her back ached, but she didn't complain. When the last guests had left and the lights dimmed, she glanced one last time at the piano. It sat there quietly, its white surface gleaming under the soft glow of the chandeliers. She walked toward it again, her steps slow and thoughtful. She sat down just for a moment and rested her hands on the keys without pressing them. The hall was empty now. No laughter, no noise. Just her and the piano. She let her fingers drift gently across the keys, not playing a song, just touching them like an old friend she had found again. A soft sigh escaped her lips. She didn't know if she'd ever get the chance to play again. But tonight had reminded her of something important, that the music inside her hadn't died. It had only been waiting. As she stood up to leave, she didn't notice Edward standing by the door watching. He had come back to retrieve his phone but stopped when he saw her at the piano again. For the first time that night, he didn't have a joke ready. There was something about the way she touched the keys that made him stop and think. But he quickly shook it off. Strange girl, he muttered under his breath and walked away. Clara never heard him. She simply took one last look at the piano, smiled faintly, and turned off the lights. Outside, the night air was cool and calm. She walked home through quiet streets, her mind still full of melodies. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like just a waitress. She felt like herself again, a musician, a dreamer, someone who still had a story to tell. She didn't know that the small moments she created in that ballroom would soon spread far beyond those walls. But for now, she was just a young woman walking home under the stars, her heart carrying a tune that no amount of mockery could silence. The next morning came quietly. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of Clara's small apartment, landing softly on the piano keys of her old worn-out keyboard. It wasn't anything fancy. A second-hand instrument she'd bought years ago when she couldn't afford a real one anymore. The paint was chipped and a few keys stuck if pressed too hard, but it was hers. She sat in front of it, still in her work clothes from the night before, staring at the keys like she wasn't sure what to do. Her mind kept replaying everything that had happened. The laughter, the stares, the sound of her own music echoing through the hall. A strange mix of pride and sadness swirled inside her. She had finally played again after so many years, but she couldn't shake off the way they had mocked her afterward. Still, something had changed. When she played last night, even for that short moment, she had felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. It was as if the music had reached into her and reminded her who she truly was. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, and began to play. It wasn't a complicated song this time, just something simple and soft. Her small apartment filled with the gentle sound of the piano, and for a few minutes she forgot about everything else. She didn't play for money or for attention or to prove anything. She played for herself. Later that day, she went back to work. The same hotel, the same polished floors, the same sound of chatter and clinking glasses. But as soon as she walked in, she could feel something different. People were talking, whispering, looking her way, smiling in small, curious ways. She didn't understand why until one of the other waiters came rushing over, eyes wide with excitement. "Did you know someone filmed you last night?" he whispered. Clara blinked. "Filmed me?" He nodded quickly and showed her his phone. There on the screen was a short video from the gala, her sitting at the piano playing that haunting melody. The video had already been shared online and comments were pouring in. People were amazed that a waitress could play like that. The caption read, "Waitress shocks guests with incredible piano performance at charity gala." Clara's stomach fluttered with nerves. She didn't know whether to be happy or scared. She hadn't asked for attention. She just wanted to play, not become a story on the internet. Throughout the day, guests who had been at the event approached her. Some smiled kindly, others just stared. A few even apologized quietly for laughing the night before. But Edward, the man who had mocked her, hadn't said a word. He was still the same, walking around with his usual air of confidence, pretending like nothing unusual had happened. That evening, the hotel hosted another event. It wasn't as large as the previous one, but the piano was still there, shining under the lights. Clara kept glancing at it as she worked, trying to ignore the way her fingers itched to play again. At one point, Edward was sitting near the bar with a few of his friends. They were talking loudly, as always, but this time the topic of conversation was her. "Apparently that video's going viral," one of them said, showing his phone. "Everyone's talking about the waitress pianist. Can you believe that?" Edward chuckled. "Viral for what?" Playing one sad song. He took a sip of his drink and shrugged. "People get impressed too easily these days." His friend laughed, but not as confidently. "Still, she's good. You saw how she played." Edward waved a hand. "She's decent. But it takes more than one emotional tune to be a real musician." What he didn't realize was that Clara had overheard them. She was standing just a few steps away, collecting empty glasses. His words stung, but they also fueled something inside her, something stronger than embarrassment or hurt. She didn't need his approval. She knew what music meant to her, and deep down she knew she had nothing to prove to someone like him. As the night went on, a small storm started outside. Thunder rolled faintly and the rain tapped against the large windows of the hall. The guests were restless, waiting for the next performer who was supposed to arrive, a hired pianist from the city. But as time passed, it became clear that the performer was delayed by the weather. The event host looked worried. The evening's highlight was meant to be a short concert, and without it, the night would fall flat. He looked around helplessly, and then his eyes landed on Clara. "You?" he said, walking over to her. "You played last night, didn't you?" Clara froze. "Yes, but I was just—" He smiled urgently. "Would you mind playing again? Just for a few minutes? We need something before the guests start leaving." Clara hesitated. "I don't think I should—" But before she could finish, Edward's voice cut in. "Let her," he said with a faint grin. "Why not? Maybe she can show us her viral talent again." The way he said it sounded like another challenge, another chance to make fun of her. But this time, Clara didn't feel small. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "All right," she said softly. The crowd turned their attention toward her as she walked to the piano. The soft light from the chandeliers reflected off the keys, and for a brief second, she could see her own reflection, calm, determined, no longer afraid. She took a deep breath and began to play. This time she didn't start softly. Her fingers moved with power and confidence. The melody was full of energy, bright, emotional, alive. It filled the hall like a wave. Every note carried strength and meaning. People stopped talking. Even the waiters in the background paused to listen. Clara wasn't just playing a song. She was telling her story again, but louder this time. Her music spoke of pain and perseverance, of dreams that refused to die. It carried hope, struggle, and beauty all at once. The storm outside seemed to match her playing. Thunder rolled as her fingers danced across the keys and lightning flashed against the tall windows. The sound of rain blended softly with her melody, as if nature itself was keeping rhythm. Edward sat completely still. The mocking grin that had lived on his face was gone. He watched, speechless, as the waitress he had laughed at played like someone born for the stage. Every note struck something inside him, something he didn't even understand. When she reached the final note, she let it linger in the air. The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was sacred. The kind of silence that only follows something truly moving. Then slowly people began to clap. Not the half-hearted applause of politeness, real thunderous applause that came from awe. Guests stood up cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Clara sat there for a moment, her heart racing, her hands trembling. She hadn't realized how deeply she had played until she looked up and saw the faces around her. Faces that had once looked down on her now filled with admiration. Edward was still sitting in his chair, but his eyes were fixed on her. For once, he didn't know what to say. He simply stood and joined in the applause, though his expression wasn't pride. It was something closer to shame, or perhaps respect. Clara smiled faintly, nodded politely to the audience, and quietly returned to her duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone knew that something extraordinary had. That night, long after the guests had gone and the lights were turned off, Edward stayed behind for a while, staring at the piano. He had always believed money could buy class, talent, and recognition. But watching Clara play had shown him something he couldn't buy. Pure, honest passion. And though he didn't say a word, a small part of him knew that the waitress he once mocked had just taught him something he'd never forget. After that night, the hotel seemed different to Clara. Even though she still wore her plain black uniform and moved between tables, there was a quiet confidence in the way she walked. People looked at her differently now. Some of the guests who had laughed at her before offered small, polite smiles almost apologetically. Others whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief over her talent. The video of her playing had spread far beyond the walls of the gala. By the next morning, her phone was flooded with messages and notifications. Strangers praised her skill, calling her a hidden prodigy and an inspiration. Some even invited her to perform at small local events, impressed by what they had seen. Clara read each message carefully, her hands shaking at the realization that her music had touched people she had never met. She didn't know whether to feel proud or scared. She had never wanted attention like this. Music had always been personal for her, a private joy that belonged only to her. But the warmth in the messages, the genuine admiration, made her heart swell. For the first time in years, she felt like she mattered for more than just the work she did. Back at the hotel, Edward couldn't shake what he had seen. He tried to continue with his usual routine, joking with his friends and boasting about his wealth, but something in him had shifted. Every time he thought of Clara at the piano, the memory tugged at him. He couldn't deny the skill, the emotion, the way she had commanded the room without even trying. It gnawed at his pride in a way he had never experienced before. He found himself watching for her whenever he visited the hotel for meetings or events. There she was, calm and quiet, going about her work with that faint, determined smile. He noticed the small gestures, the way she interacted with guests kindly, how she moved with confidence despite her modest appearance. Edward had always believed that success was about money and status, but watching Clara now, he realized that real talent and character were something different entirely. One afternoon, the hotel manager asked Clara to come into the office. She wasn't sure what to expect and felt a small wave of nervousness as she walked down the corridor. When she entered, the manager smiled warmly. "Clara," he said, "I've been hearing a lot about you." I don't understand," she said softly. "The guests are talking about your performance," he explained. "They were amazed last night, and the video online has made quite an impression. People are asking if you can perform again. Not just here, at events, for private functions, even for charity concerts." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "I'm just a waitress," she said. I wasn't performing professionally." "I know," the manager said gently, "but talent like yours doesn't stay hidden forever. If you want, we can arrange a proper chance for you to play, and I think it could be life-changing." For a moment, Clara didn't respond. She looked at the worn floor, thinking of her old music school. the years she had lost and the nights spent working instead of following her dream. Then she looked up. I think I'd like to try, she said quietly. Word of Clara's talent continued to spread. Guests who had been at the gala returned, some just to see her play again. Others sent messages to the hotel, asking when she might perform. People admired not only her skill but the humility with which she carried herself. She wasn't seeking fame or recognition, yet her music spoke louder than anyone's words. One evening, the hotel arranged a small private performance in the ballroom. Only a handful of guests were invited, but the atmosphere was intimate and respectful. Clara approached the piano, a small thrill running through her. She remembered the first time she had played in that same room, how the laughter had cut through her confidence. But now she felt ready. She sat down, closed her eyes, and let her fingers find the keys. The music began gently, flowing like a quiet stream, but soon it grew bolder, more confident, each note carrying depth and emotion. The guests listened intently, captivated by the story the music told. Some whispered to each other, unable to believe the talent in front of them. Others were silent, tears forming in their eyes as the melody spoke to something deep inside them. Edward was in the front row, trying to remain composed. He had expected to feel in control, to observe and maybe make a small joke as he often did, but he couldn't. Clara's music held him spellbound. Every note reminded him of the mistake he had made in judging her. He realized that he had been blind to the true value of talent, of perseverance, of passion. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. But this time it wasn't just polite clapping. The guests rose to their feet, cheering, some calling out her name. Clara's cheeks warmed as she stood and gave a small, gracious bow. She had never felt anything like this before, a mix of pride, joy, and humility. Edward finally stepped forward, hesitant. His usual confident smile was gone. He looked her in the eye. I underestimated you, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I thought I was seeing something simple, something to mock. But that was extraordinary. Clara smiled gently, nodding. She didn't need to hear praise from him, but it mattered in a small way. He had learned something too, that talent and character were not measured by wealth or appearance. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Invitations poured in for Clara to perform at charity events, private gatherings, and even small concerts. She was nervous at first, unsure if she could handle the attention, but with each performance her confidence grew. She remembered why she had loved music in the first place, the way it could touch people, move them, and make them feel something beyond words. Through it all, she remained humble. She never let the attention change who she was. She still worked at the hotel, still greeted guests with the same warmth, and still carried herself with quiet grace. Her life was changing, but her heart stayed rooted in what mattered most, the music and the joy it brought. And Edward, he continued to watch. But now he wasn't mocking. He was learning, quietly observing someone who had more courage, talent, and strength than he had ever expected. He began to respect her, in a way that was more meaningful than any wealth or power he possessed. Clara's story became more than just a tale of talent revealed. It became a lesson for everyone around her, that true skill cannot be ignored, that passion cannot be silenced, and that humility and perseverance are as powerful as the most glittering wealth. Even after the applause faded, the invitations stopped and the videos circulated online. The memory of that night, the night she first played at the gala, the night she turned mockery into admiration, stayed with her. It reminded her that she had a voice, a gift, and a place in the world that no one could take away. For Clara, every performance after that was not about proving herself. It was about sharing the part of her soul that lived in the piano, the music that had waited quietly for the right moment to shine. And for everyone who listened, it was a chance to remember that true talent often comes from the most unexpected places. And in the midst of it all, Clara realized something important. She had not only reclaimed her music, but she had also reclaimed herself. The world had laughed, questioned, and doubted her. But she had risen above it, not for fame, not for wealth, but for the sheer love of the music that had always been a part of her. The days after Clara's performance at the hotel passed in a blur. She woke each morning to messages and emails from people she had never met, all praising her music and asking her to perform. Invitations arrived from small concert halls, local schools, and charity events. Each one filled her with both excitement and nervousness. She had never imagined that her music could reach so many people, and the thought of stepping into a bigger world both thrilled and terrified her. Despite the attention, Clara remained grounded. She continued to work at the hotel, serving guests, pouring drinks, and clearing tables. It was familiar, steady work, and it reminded her of where she had started. But now, every task she completed carried a quiet confidence. She moved differently, stood taller, and smiled with more assurance. There was a sense of purpose in her steps that had been missing before. She knew that her life was changing, and she was ready to embrace it. One afternoon, the hotel manager approached her with a small envelope in hand. "Clara, someone left this for you," he said with a kind smile. She opened it to find a note from a local music foundation. They had watched her videos online and wanted to offer her a scholarship to a music program that would allow her to study and perform professionally. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she read the letter. It was everything she had dreamed of years ago but had believed was out of reach. The next few weeks were filled with preparations. She visited the music school to meet the instructors, selected the pieces she would study, and slowly started imagining a life where music wasn't just a hidden part of her, but the center of her world. She practiced relentlessly, sometimes late into the night, her fingers flying over the keys as if they had never stopped. Each note reminded her of the first time she had sat at a piano in that grand hotel, when she had felt the music awaken inside her again. Meanwhile, Edward couldn't stop thinking about her. He had always believed that wealth and confidence could buy respect, but Clara's talent had shown him otherwise. He watched as her story spread online and began to admire her courage, discipline, and humility. For the first time, he realized that admiration couldn't be demanded or bought. It had to be earned, and Clara had earned it effortlessly. He eventually decided to reach out. He asked the hotel manager to arrange a meeting with Clara. She was hesitant at first, unsure why he wanted to see her, but agreed. When they met, Edward looked different from the first time she had encountered him. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a genuine expression of respect. "Clara," he began, "I wanted to apologize. I shouldn't have laughed at you that night. I underestimated you and I was wrong. You're incredible. I just wanted you to know that." Clara smiled softly. "Thank you," she said. "I've learned that sometimes people only see what they want to see. But it's okay. What matters is the music, not their opinion." Edward nodded slowly. "I see that now. And I hope you don't mind me saying, I'm proud of what you're doing. You've shown everyone, including me, that talent and heart are more important than appearances or status." Clara's heart warmed at his words. It wasn't just the apology that mattered, but the recognition of her journey, the acknowledgement that she had persevered despite the odds. For years, she had hidden her gift, thinking it didn't matter. Now people were finally seeing her for who she truly was. Her first professional performance came a few weeks later. It was a small concert at a local auditorium, attended by friends, family, and some of the guests from the hotel. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she approached the piano, but as soon as her fingers touched the keys, everything else faded away. The music flowed from her effortlessly, carrying the stories of her past, the struggles she had faced, and the hope she had for the future. The audience listened in awe. Some had tears in their eyes, some were smiling in quiet admiration, and all were captivated by the depth and emotion of her playing. Clara realized that her music could reach beyond words, that it could touch hearts in ways nothing else could. After the performance, people approached her with praise, some asking for advice or lessons, others simply thanking her for sharing her gift. Clara felt a quiet satisfaction, not from the applause, but from the connection her music had created. For the first time in her life, she felt seen and understood, not for her job or her appearance, but for the person she truly was. Edward attended that concert as well. He sat quietly in the back, watching her perform, a small smile on his face. He had seen many talented musicians in his life, but Clara's story, her humility, and the authenticity in her playing had left a mark on him. He understood now that wealth and influence could not replace hard work, dedication, and heart. Over the next months, Clara's life transformed. She continued to work at the hotel part-time, but her main focus became music. She performed at local events, charity concerts, and even started teaching small classes for children who couldn't afford lessons. She loved seeing the spark in their eyes when they played for the first time, reminding her of the feeling she had when she first sat at a piano years ago. The community began to recognize her not just as a talented pianist, but as someone who inspired others through perseverance and kindness. Articles were written about her journey from waitress to pianist, sharing her story of resilience and talent. People admired her not only for her skill, but also for her humility and her willingness to help others follow their dreams. Through it all, Clara remained grounded. She never let the attention change who she was. She remembered the nights she had spent practicing in her small apartment, the long hours at work, and the moments of doubt she had overcome. Every note she played carried a piece of her journey, a reminder that success was not just about fame, but about staying true to herself and the things that mattered most. Edward eventually became a supporter, quietly attending her performances and sometimes offering assistance when needed. He never tried to take credit or impose his influence. Instead, he admired from the sidelines, learning humility and respect from someone he had once underestimated. Clara's music continued to reach more people, each performance touching hearts in ways she had never imagined. Her story became a reminder to everyone that talent can be hidden in the most unexpected places, that perseverance can overcome ridicule, and that true recognition comes not from wealth or status, but from authenticity and dedication. And for Clara, the greatest reward was not the applause or the attention, but the knowledge that she had reclaimed her life, her passion, and her music. She had taken what was once hidden, overlooked, and undervalued, and transformed it into something extraordinary. Not for anyone else, but for herself. Her journey was a testament to the power of believing in oneself even when the world laughs. She had turned mockery into admiration, doubt into opportunity, and a quiet love for music into a life full of purpose and joy. Clara knew that she would continue to play, to inspire, and to share her gift with the world, a gift that no one could ever take away. And as she sat at the piano, hands poised over the keys, she smiled, knowing that the journey was far from over. Each note she played was a step forward, a new chapter, a promise that the music would always guide her, and that she would never again be silenced. Months had passed since that first night at the gala, and Clara's life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. She was no longer just the quiet waitress who served drinks with a polite smile. She was a musician with a growing reputation, someone people sought out not for what she could carry on a tray, but for the music she carried in her soul. Even so, she remained grounded. She still worked some shifts at the hotel, partly because she liked the familiar routine, partly because she didn't want to forget where she had come from. The piano in the ballroom had become her favorite place in the building. Every time she sat down and let her fingers find the keys, she felt that same rush of life and joy that had awakened inside her the night she had first played in front of Edward and the other guests. But Clara's journey wasn't without challenges. With more attention came more scrutiny. People expected her to perform perfectly every time, and some critics even tried to diminish her talent, claiming that a waitress suddenly performing like a professional was a fluke. Clara listened politely to some of the comments, ignored others, but inside the weight of expectations pressed on her chest. She reminded herself of the first time she had played at the gala, how terrified she had been, and how freeing it felt to just let her heart speak through the piano. That memory became her anchor. One afternoon, she received an invitation to perform at a large charity event in the city, one of the most prestigious gatherings she had been asked to join. It was a chance to step onto a stage far beyond the hotel's ballroom, in front of hundreds of people who had never seen her play. Clara felt a flutter of nerves, but also a thrill. She knew that this could be a turning point, a moment that might define her path as a musician. The day of the performance arrived quickly. Clara spent hours preparing, practicing every note, imagining every movement. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, not to draw attention, but to feel confident and comfortable. When she arrived at the venue, she was struck by the grandeur of the hall. Chandeliers hung high, the stage was polished to a shine, and the audience was already filling the seats. She felt a familiar mix of excitement and anxiety. Backstage, she could hear the murmurs of the crowd. Some people whispered her name, clearly curious about the waitress pianist who had captured hearts online. Others were skeptical, waiting to see if the talent everyone spoke of could hold up under the pressure of a larger audience. Clara took a deep breath and reminded herself that she wasn't playing for them. She was playing for herself, for the music and for the story she wanted to tell. When it was her turn, she walked onto the stage, the spotlight warm on her face. The audience grew silent as she approached the piano. She sat down and rested her hands on the keys, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Then slowly she began to play. The first notes were soft, careful, like a whisper reaching out to touch the hearts of the audience. But soon the melody grew richer, more complex, more alive. Clara poured everything she had into the performance. The years of sacrifice, the nights of practice alone, the pain and joy of her journey. Each note seemed to carry a piece of her soul, and the audience responded instinctively, leaning forward, holding their breath, feeling the music in a way that went beyond words. In the front row, Edward watched silently. He had attended the event to support her, but he found himself completely captivated by the performance. He remembered the first night at the hotel, when he had laughed at her and realized how wrong he had been. Clara had not only proved him wrong, she had gone far beyond anyone's expectations. The music swelled, filling the hall with emotion. Clara's fingers moved across the keys with precision and grace, but it wasn't just technical skill that held the audience's attention. It was the heart behind the music, the story she was telling without words. People were moved to tears, some of them leaning toward each other, trying to share the emotion that seemed too big for words. As the final note lingered in the air, the hall was silent for a heartbeat, as if everyone was holding on to the moment, unwilling to let it end. Then slowly the applause began. At first it was soft, but it quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. People stood, clapping and cheering, some shouting words of encouragement. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes as she bowed, humbled by the overwhelming response. After the performance, many came forward to congratulate her. Some were fellow musicians who wanted to collaborate. Others were event organizers hoping to invite her to future concerts. But amid all the attention, Clara's favorite moments were the quiet ones. The children in the audience who came up to her afterwards, eyes wide, saying they wanted to learn to play just like her. She smiled at them, feeling a deep sense of purpose. This was why she played, to inspire, to connect, to share something that could touch others' hearts. Edward approached her once the crowd had dispersed. His usual confident demeanor was softened by genuine respect. "Clara," he said, I don't even know how to describe it. That was incredible. I never imagined someone could play with so much heart and skill. You've shown everyone, including me, what real talent looks like." Clara smiled politely. "Thank you," she said. I play because I love it. I want to share it with others. That's all that matters to me." He nodded, understanding. For once, Edward realized that admiration couldn't be forced or bought. It had to be earned through dedication, passion, and integrity. Clara had earned it, not through wealth or connections, but through her talent and her courage to share it with the world. In the weeks that followed, Clara's life continued to grow in exciting ways. She performed at more concerts, sometimes traveling to nearby cities. She was invited to collaborate with other musicians, to play for charitable causes, and even to mentor young students who dreamed of playing the piano. Each opportunity reminded her of how far she had come, from the quiet waitress at a hotel gala to a musician inspiring hundreds of people with her gift. Even with all the success, Clara remained humble. She continued to work part-time at the hotel, not because she needed the money, but because it reminded her of her roots. She still served drinks and cleared tables with the same quiet grace, but now there was a spark in her step, a sense of pride in who she had become. Her story inspired others. People began to share it online, not just as a tale of talent, but as a lesson in perseverance, humility, and the courage to pursue one's dreams despite obstacles. Clara became a symbol for anyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or doubted. She showed them that it was possible to rise above mockery and fear, to reclaim what was lost, and to create a life full of purpose and joy. Edward, who had once laughed at her, became one of her quiet supporters. He never tried to overshadow her accomplishments, but he admired her deeply. He learned from her example that wealth and status could never replace heart, dedication, or genuine talent. Watching Clara grow and succeed taught him humility and respect, lessons he carried with him beyond the concert halls and hotel ballrooms. Clara knew that her journey was far from over. There would be challenges, critics, and moments of doubt. But she had discovered something far more valuable than fame or recognition. She had discovered herself. She had found her voice, her passion, and the courage to share it with the world. And as she sat at the piano each day, whether in a quiet practice room or a grand concert hall, she remembered that first night at the hotel, when the laughter and mockery had threatened to silence her. That memory reminded her that obstacles could be transformed into opportunities, that doubt could become determination, and that a single act of courage could change the course of a life. Her fingers danced across the keys, each note a testament to resilience, hope, and the beauty of following one's heart. And with every performance, she reminded herself and everyone who listened that true talent knows no boundaries, no social status, and no limitations. Only the willingness to be brave enough to let it shine.